Maybe I'll start. I think that it might be interesting to hear, before we get into the content of your work, think about the process, because I think that helps us kind of get to there. And I'm going to read, because then if not, I'll go off on like little tangents here and there, but so I try to keep this kind of direct. But in the past we've talked a lot about social practice. And social practice is just an art medium focusing on engagement through human interaction and social discourse. Is kind of the official social practice thread. But in your work, I see this as an aspect of collaboration and the sharing of knowledge through your creative process. Specifically, your installation work, where you invite people not just to gather materials with you, but to also lend a hand in the art making process. Can you speak to the roots of this in your work, and how does this develop? Is it like an intentional piece, or is this just kind of out of necessity of needing help, and was it all planned out?
I think that it happened because participating in ceremonies over many years, I was always amazed by what happens before. And we sometimes, don't think about our participation from the moment you think about what you're going to do to the moment that you're done as being part of the whole. And so, my grandmother, I think, influenced me quite a bit by how it was that she approached everything she did, as a collaboration. Housekeeping, for instance, I think was the first thing that hit me, that she always asked me to do things, but if I didn't respond in a kind of a good way, like, oh yeah, it's time to do this, she would just tell me to just go ahead and do what I was doing, and she would do it, which felt really bad. It didn't feel good. You couldn't continue doing what you were doing with any kind of, honor. So that was one thought that kind of got ignited by the ceremonial space, in realizing that, that there had to be a whole process, and that the whole process then brought you in contact with people that you shared, or that shared information with you. And it took me a while then to connect everything, but I think that because I had everything in categories, you're taught as an artist that it's an individual process. And I've seen artists, I visited artist studios where they farm out certain aspects of it, like they pay people to make things for them because they're busy, they don't have time, and it's all those there are different reasons, even as you get older and having to manage everything. But ceremonially, I found that two things. One, the very first time I arrived and I was trying to be helpful, I had no idea how to be helpful, and I was told, well, make the coffee in the morning, which sounds really simple, except that you have to make a fire to make the coffee. And I was at a ceremony, so I thought, how do you make a ceremonial fire? Do you get two sticks and rub them together? And how do you do that? I don't know, I had this really high thought of how to do it. So I'm there trying to figure out how to make fire. And one of the elders, which meant I was standing there puzzled, right? This elder comes out and he sits down and he starts to roll a cigarette, and he's watching me as I'm standing there trying to figure out, how do I make this fire happen? And I've got all this pile of wood and everything, thrown into this pit, and he leans over and he gets his Bic and he lights it. And it just felt so, I laughed. I had to laugh at myself because I just made it so big, and of course, he had to do a lot more than that, but it was just the action of his participation without really saying anything to me. And that started my thinking, always, right? It connects up to like how you're trying to do things. And then secondly was, again, being at a ceremony and getting there in time to see all the preparation. Everything that has to be done. And even from the building of porta potties to, setting up of kitchens, to the cooking of food, to everything that you think is not part of something but is. So that kind of started to chip away at my little boxes of like, this is art making, and this is being in the world, and this is this, and this is that. It all kind of started to collapse. So more than anything else, it was the enjoyment, of the process of coming together to do something, and having, not having any hierarchies in it, really, because even how I'm doing things, I'm always taught. There's always a teaching moment, when I'm trying to figure something out, and I really don't know how, and someone always steps in and, helps. It's that aspect of it, that it isn't about, that the idea is one thing, but it doesn't, maybe we won't even get to that, because something else needs to happen. And you don't know that by yourself. It always happens in a collective process.
I had a question about that, just in terms of your artistic practice, because you do incorporate social practice, which is collaborative with other artists, it's an exchange. There's also teaching that I think for future generations, because having taken your courses a long, long, long time ago here, you taught us a lot, and you've taught a lot of the kind of younger generation of artists, and artists not quite as young, my generation, that have learned your way of making art. So that is incorporated in your artistic practice. And then how, as curators and as an artist that exhibits intentionally in museums and gallery spaces, which are very different than community spaces, how do you consider when the work is then placed and left there, especially given the context that you and I have discussed your work as a prayer? It's a prayer for that space. So what does it mean then to exhibit social practice? Because, it's a process, but then there's this final piece that then needs to live in the world. And so I'm just, in terms of my curatorial practice, I'm just really interested in that. And I don't know if I've totally skipped over the social practice part, Jesus, but I think it's really interesting as a, in terms of exhibiting artists, which you all are, and you all in some way have social practice. What does that mean for you when you're putting this work up and leaving it somewhere?
Okay. One second. I mean, the only thing I would say, because I think that is the biggest question in social practice, is like how does an artist do something like create some social kind of engagement and then create an aesthetic component to that? Yeah. So I mean, I think it is like because. Yeah,
and then the meaning it takes on once it's in that space.
Yeah, you can't control the meaning at all.
Yeah.
What you can't control that. I think of it this way. Not everything I do is appreciated by everybody. But I think I have to trust, that there's a trust factor there, that because I myself have gone to exhibitions, I see artists all the time. I don't always appreciate their work. Sometimes I have a hard time getting there. I'm like, and I find that when that happens to me, that I honestly have to go away and think about it. One, I have to get out of my ego, like I know, and get into the I don't know, so that I can sit there and think about, like, what was it that I didn't appreciate? Like, what was it that stopped me, that stalled me, that I have to go back and think about? And so once I do that, I realize, that it is really about what I don't know, what challenges me. And I have to come to some kind of resolution with it myself. Sometimes I really, truly don't agree, but I can always find, a respect for the process. So I have to say the same thing, right? That, you make a prayer and you have a full intention, and you can't always control how it's received. But it has to be in the process. Even sometimes I think the learning process of like what happens when it's not understood, where it's not received. And then you have to go back and to figure out, like, what happened and what do you take away from that, so that I figured that out, that, that I don't always have to be right, and that I can hold it, have to stand up for it. This is what I made, this is what I did, and then it's, you learn. I think that's the piece of it, that social practice. And because I know I've met people, artists, not very many, but I have met artists that do not show their work. They make it for themselves, and they never take it out. You see it because you know them, and you go to their house, and if you're lucky, they let you in the room where they make the work. Some of it's really beautiful work. And I ask them, why does it only live here? And they're like, well, it's just for me. It's just the pleasure that I get in making it, but it's not intended to be seen. And I feel like it's just sort of like little jewels, that live in their home. But to me, the part of the art making is incomplete until it's in the world. That I need that connection, that conversation is why I'm making work. I'm trying to engage. I'm thinking about something, and I need a check-in. So that to me the work is about thinking and then putting it in the world so that I can get a feedback, conversation out of it as to, what is happening, what are we thinking about at this moment about our world. I think that's the engagement. There's a comment back there.
Are we allowed to, I guess, share, what do you call the word, partake in the conversation,
Yeah, I would say so.
Going on up there.
Break the fourth wall.
Yes, please.
Well, I just wanted to share a quick teaching, because the question that you asked, it's a big question, but it's very important. It has an important point, and it's a confusing one, and because there's so many people, so many different tribes, so many different nations, and the way that they see their spirituality and their arts and crafts and stuff like that. So there's a teaching that takes care of that sometimes people aren't aware of. And I want to share it with you, and that's, the question is that when you make art and you're putting in a spiritual aspect to it, so you're calling your artwork a prayer, and you take this prayer and you're putting it in a museum or in some type of a space where other people can see it. So people are going to come there and going to see these, what is deemed as ceremonial things in there, with feathers, tobacco, the different elements and stuff like that. And they say, how can this person come over here and make this and just leave that there and go? That's disrespect to those things. That's the question. That's sometimes the feeling that people are going to say. They're going to say, gee, they did something, they're not even taking care of it. I wasn't raised that way. So what it comes down to is that, anytime we make an art and craft and we share it with someone buys it, or we give it to someone, we don't know how they're going to take care of it. As soon as it goes out of your hand, that's it. And how they take care of it, how they take care of it. So there is a teaching about that. It says when you're making a prayer, you have to stand there with it. There was a time when I was young, I was making a prayer and I had a piece of sage and I lit the sage and it was smoking. I put it on a quarter and I left it in the kitchen. I was doing some stuff and I came back and this person was trying to tell me, you shouldn't do that. You're just leaving that tobacco, that sage burning right there. You're supposed to hold your prayer. So there is a teaching about standing by your prayers and holding your prayers. But there's also another teaching, when we're doing cultural education. And in that realm, those things instantly become protected because it's not just left there alone. It's not like you just came and put this and walked away. These facilities, they have camera system, they have security system, they have curators, and we have to put our trust in them. Us as artists, we trust the curators, they're gonna watch out for that. Not let someone come over, disrespect that, steal that, move it, or hurt it. I can't come in here, you're inviting me into your home and say, can you do this art project? Yeah, I'm gonna do this art project, but I don't trust you. I don't trust you. Who are you? Who are you to watch over my stuff? That's not gonna be a good, you're not gonna make a good rapport with the people that you're working with. You have to trust. You have to trust them and say, okay, it's not just left there alone. It is under the care and stuff like that. So another step on top of this is this. There's two types of artists. There's a beginner, just getting started, just getting on the road of the art road. Then there's others that have been on it 30, 40, 50 years. And along that journey, you put in your work, so to say. So in other words, part of our culture, when we go on the hill to pray, so we make our altar and we sit on our altar, we become our altar. So we don't make the altar and sit there for an hour and then go. Okay, yeah, you're not holding it down. But when you come in here and you sit there for the 4 days, 4 nights, every year for years, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you go to Sundance and you Sundance out there. all 4 days without eating water or drinking food. What you're doing in your life is you're making a prayer, you're standing by it in front of the Creator right then and there, and you're showing that. And you're doing that over a long period of time, so you develop what they call experience. So when you've got an experienced ceremonialist that's been going to ceremony all their life, doing this all their life, and they do something, they kind of get a little leeway to put that there and leave it. You're not supposed to jump on them because they know what they're doing. Because they proved it in their life with the amount of years that they've been in their ceremonial community, sweat lodge, different type of Native American church ceremonies, different type of danza, So when you get a new student that just started maybe college learning art, and they haven't went through a lot of the ceremonies, a lot of the rites of passage that our spiritual leaders that are different, leaders have been through. Well then, they come in, you put it there, and you ask them, well, they don't know what the tobacco they're teaching, they don't know the teaching of the sage, they don't know the teaching of the copal, they don't know the teaching of the papers, they don't know the teaching of the woods, they don't know the teaching of the candles and the colors, and all those things they don't know. So of course you're gonna say, gee, they just made something and left it, that's not good. But so there's a leeway in there. For the beginner, it's not good. But for the experience, it's okay because they've proved it through life. They're not just leaving it there. So sometimes some nations of people, they don't know the person who's making that, and they don't take the time to learn who that is. They come right away and make that. Oh, they just left this here. Is that right? To make art with the ceremonial, spiritual input into it, and then put that there and leave tonight, and leave it there for 3 months. Some people are going to say, that's not right.
And that is a criticism that's leveled. So I think it's great that you are addressing that because it's
So
definitely
I just wanted
something.
to share, because these things that I say are not right, they're all mental mind viruses, ceremonial spiritual mind viruses. And the only way you're going to get unlocked from those mind viruses, you have to know the ceremonial spiritual antidote. And the antidote are the teachings. And that's why they say, don't skip the teaching. You go to sweat one time, doesn't mean tomorrow you're going to run a Sundance. Take the time to walk the road each step. So I just wanted to share that on behalf of you, Mom. With the question that they're asking. I'm really serious about that. There was some criticism. I want to clear that up.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mateo.
Listening to me.
That was very useful. Thank
My
you.
comment.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
One time recently, talking to Celia said the avant-garde, the most kind of avant-garde was, the community-based art practice that emerged out of the Chicano movement. I feel like maybe it comes out differently in my mouth than the way you uttered it, which was very beautiful and powerful. That I guess I want to go back to what Lada shared about, the question about where is the line between religious ritual and art, because I'm wondering if you can speak to the line. I feel in many ways that there's a kind of abolitionism embedded in your decolonial practice. That there's what does it mean to have the divisions between what is Chicanx art and social practice, or what is the division between social practice, Chicanx art, and art with a capital A, or what is the division between the spirit, ceremony, and art, and what is the division between and when we had the exhibit Chicanx Futurity, and we were in deep conversation for long times around the what the work brings forward, and I think all of us were really who were engaged in that were in awe of just your approach and your integrity and your which really was a kind of genius to kind of see past the line oftentimes in order to be able to realize what was like the true intention. So I think part of that was in thinking about what does it mean to abolish borders, but also what does it mean to you as a kind of a living, breathing human being, spiritual being that is negotiating those boundaries or lines or borders to being able to be who you need to be as a person who where art is and it is intimately tied to your spiritual expression and being.
Oh. I think I have to, for one, I think I've always seen myself as a dissident. A dissident. I went to, I was fortunate to be able to go on the Venceremos Brigade to Cuba when I was really young, like 18. And being there amongst so many people, the United States, activists and organizers and progressive peoples, and to be amongst all of these people of color, third world people, all these communities from coast to coast and Midwest, and then to meet in Cuba all of the folks that I'd only read about, or people from Africa and Vietnam, the Vietnamese, that were there on R&R, that were the dismantlers of bombs, really young people, that had seen so much in their lives, and the Chilenos that found themselves caught, because of the coup at that time in Cuba. It was very arousing, it woke me up in a my life in Sacramento was very, very small and very limited to what I was there in front of me, so I was fortunate. It was like a prayer, like I got to be someplace that just opened my eyes to the continent and to the world and to something bigger than myself. And I think it kind of attached itself to, I went to school at a small Catholic school, and Irish nuns who were, among the most progressive, as it turned out, at the time, fighting the church and fighting the hierarchy and wanting to express themselves and wanting to be part of society. And they left us with this idea of having something bigger than you. But I didn't know what that looked like or what that meant. I just know that that I felt that there were things that I had to do, participate in the world, and so I just wasn't thinking about, the limits of those things, that there were limits of those things, and there were many limits. Being young, as a young woman, there were many folks, trying to determine what I was doing and how I was doing it. But I was fortunate to have a very strong grandmother. I was fortunate to see examples of this world at that time, those times in the early 70s, late 60s. I think we inherited the radical nature of the 30s and 40s. We were still living it. It influenced us tremendously. I was fortunate to then be able to be in conversations that were multi-generational. I was fortunate to have grown up with my grandmother's friends who were, the working women of our community. There were, so many things that were there that I was kind of, in a sense, felt very free. And chose to be an artist because it was a way that I could, that sort of felt good to me to do some work in community. I always felt that it was more than just what I was doing. And I think I still do, because as you're speaking, I think, I've learned so much from this generation. I mean, it's interesting to me. I want to have more conversations with the generation, especially those that I'm looking at, the generation influenced by the indigenous movement of this world. It's very, it's growing. And the influence, the conversation that's emerging, the language that's emerging, the ideas that are emerging, it is very generational. I was fortunate to sit with the elders. They're gone. The majority of them are gone. Their voices are gone. Sometimes I think I will not hear that voice again. I think of the poetry of Jose Montoya, and I think I'll never hear that cadence again. This is a different cadence, a different generation. I had to agree with myself that that was okay. Otherwise, I'd be stuck someplace, be stuck, with what used to be. And that's not very useful to us, because our prayer has been the coming of this generation. Just like when I read the story of the California people here, it was the elder women that sort of held open the door, knowing that this generation would come. I've observed that in the work of, Colleen Sisk, who bringing her children home to camp out at Jones Valley, under great criticism for bringing them back to live at home in a rural area where their schooling might not be as good. But she has raised a generation that is now a people, by raising them together. So these decisions that you make, you're kind of, I feel like, the bottom line, right, always is looking towards the generations. It's almost like like we keep saying, right, you have to look back to look forward. It's not that you're backwards looking, it's that you know what's coming. And I don't know, I feel like there's just so much, that, I sit here and I think, wow, my own children, my own family, they had to really have some sacrifices in order for me to do the work. It isn't like it was free and clear work. It cost a lot, in terms of our family, in terms of, of where and how. And so, to me, it's an amazing thing to sit here generationally and have this time, because whatever it is you're doing, it's not like I know the path. I'm just kind of going, okay, I'm just going to start that way, and then, the postings will happen, I hope, as you maneuver the road. But it was Jesus, who began using the term social practice. And I remember saying to him, thank you, because I never knew what I was doing quite, I was just an odd egg artist, right? I'm trying to do all these things. And then Jesus says, hey, you're doing this work, this process. And I'm going, wow, thank you. Now I can actually put the title after my name or something. And, the work of all of these folks here, Gilda sitting there, Laura, your writing. I mean, we don't have enough writing. This is true. We don't have enough. I think there has been, in the UC system, we need to have a revolution, because it isn't a glass ceiling. It's an armored wall, to the art department. We cannot get in there. I used to tell my students the first day, there's a law in California that says there can only be one Chicano artist per 1,000-mile radius. And once you get yours, you're good to go, right?
You need to move.
You can't have one in printmaking and one in painting, no. But and really. The generation, I say, that so moved us, the generation of the 60s, that was brought in there because of the young folks' demonstrations and demands. They didn't come in there because somebody said, hey, we need to have these folks here. It was in demand, and it was done, by force. And they were always treated that way. And as soon as that generation began moving through the ranks and became senior, they did not continue to fill the ranks. So there's huge gaps. Those that have retired, and now, for the last 30 years, there has been no hires for the most part. So when we're talking art history, and we're talking art practice, and we're talking criticism, and we're talking education, we're bereft. But when you look at Chicano studies, and the commitment to the artist, it is again a cost, because we're not full professors. We don't have the ability to take sabbaticals. We don't have the ability to do research, but we do hard work. If you look at the working artists in all the programs, they are very hardworking artists. sometimes teaching way beyond the call of showing up in the classroom. And where is the work happening? It's happening in the community centers. Every time, Jesus and Melanie show up to print, it is the education process is happening there as artists get to see, hey, this is a process. Pina at Woodland has been I've been over a year now spending time there, and it's been so generative and fruitful. Esther began volunteering at the museum and was fortunate to have somebody interested in seeing her gifts, and yet, so you have this growth, this generational growth, that I think matters, because in the Chicano movement, I think that the generation, that said the arts are not just about decoration, but a way of thinking, a way of living, a way of looking, and especially a way of engaging in our community, creating a vision and creating an image and community that didn't exist. So when I left my house as a young woman, where did I see examples of my culture? At the Veterans Center with the folklorico, and the bailes. That was it. There was no, art making and visuality of who it was that we were. That first generation, that was the task, and a task that they took on very seriously. And so we have this generational experience. And so I feel, I'm looking out now going, so as we're all exiting in this direction, who's following, and how is the work not being institutionalized, but how is it that we are engaging in the institution? So for me, the museum and the university, have been the place of struggle. They're the place where I've chosen to do a lot of the work and activism. So when I say community, I don't know why people keep saying, well, this isn't the real community. What is it then? If the university is not on, the Chochenyo Ohlone land, it's all, it's all one thing. Keep saying, oh, this is not the real world. I'm like, well, what is the real world then? So museums and public spaces that are supposed to be representative do become the place of engagement and struggle, just as much as the Washington Neighborhood Center in Sacramento and Tana and all the centers that we activate. Mission Culture Center right now, the exhibition has been activated. Museum has been activated. Although I would like to see it not just during October.
Yeah.
I would like to see it much more often. But that is our task, I think. I think when we think social practice, it is really engaging our community, and holding that, right? As a task, not as a charity or service. That language kind of is upsetting. I think it is, the work. It's like, where is the work? So when I was working for the Mexican Museum and they were interested in having people come into the museum, I said, well, might this not be an opportunity for us to be in community? So what is museum then? What is its tasks? Those are all questions, I think, that has been, how do I put it? That has been opened up in Chicano art making by thinking of it, a little differently from object making to a process, of engagement.
If I can pop in for a moment, it seems to me that kind of like stubbornness in the good sense, right? Hanging on with tenacity to something that, other people don't support, right? There's a kind of it seems to me that in Chicanx art, that there's this kind of stubbornness around the importance of community, right? And community being able to come where the work is, right? Whether that's a museum or not, and the why. Why is it being made, right? It's not just being made so that the artist will become famous and collected, right? There's something that maybe some generations have thought is old-fashioned or out of touch, but it's the issue of higher purpose, right? It's what do we serve when we circulate work? seems to me, you know?
But I think that's where we also have to hold the institutions accountable then,
Mhm.
because I mean, in this age of like diversity and this talk about bringing more curators of color or more artists of color in the museums, we also have to deal with the space and mitigate the space and have people in those places that know how to mitigate the space. And I've always, the parallel for me, and I guess being a Chicanx studies major, has always been how do you penetrate the institution in your own way? Not that it doesn't come with, you know, it's certainly fraught and there's certainly concessions and I mean, it's not a easy road, let's say. But I feel like where museums fall short is that we haven't demanded the institutions, of these institutions, what we have demanded from the university. And that is creating a space where we can potentially do the kind of work that we need to do. And so that's why I think it's really important when I'm thinking about the work that I'm doing in a mainstream contemporary art space, which is not a space that has been equitable historically or that has fully represented our community, is how then do we hold ourselves accountable so that we can meet her halfway? Because it's not Celia's job to transform the space. I mean, I think that's certainly her work does when when I say it exposes the blind spots, and that's what my thesis was about, was looking at, wow, when I bring this work in, there is a whole lot of problems with this museum, you know, and it's not her job to address that, it's my job. And so I think that's where museums are really far behind in that way. So, I don't know if that answered anything, but we need to do that work.
Yeah, I'll ask you though, okay, so we've talked about Jimmy Durham, and one of the things that and bring up Jimmy Durham because he also has there's a lot of issues surrounding his whole identity and who he is as an indigenous person and the questioning of what he is, right? But at the same time, we can look at his work and the way that he's chosen to make objects that don't reference his spirituality or his spiritual practices. And he chooses that for his own reasons, although you can see the res in his work. And so there is some kind of reference to his own Indianness, right? And I have there's an artist, a personal friend of mine, Benvenuto Chawahai from Guatemala, and he's Mayan Tzotzil, and he says in his language they have no word for the word art. They have words for making and for the sacred. And in his own practice, he says that he goes away from that, and he just makes things that are crazy. And in your practice, you've gone towards the spiritual, towards the sacred, towards making. And I guess for me, it's interesting because you have, as been talked about, there's this process of demystifying the ceremony that you do in your work, as well as what I think, and I don't know if this is your intention, but bring young people who are experiencing this work for the first time into that ceremonial space, maybe for the first time, and experiencing those medicines. And so that brings us to this question of what is the role of the artist? Is, you know, in ceremonial life, we have things like roadmen, roadwomen, we have spiritual leaders, we have people who take care of the chanupa, who have a role in society, and as being a detribalized, deterritorialized people, I don't know if we have that. We don't have, as you were talking about the vision quest, I don't have anyone to go and like, can you take me on my vision quest? And what role does the artist fulfill that in our communities in this time?
Well, I was just thinking about the first artist that I was introduced to. You know, I studied with Pina, and I say that he was very influential in the sense that, I don't know if you know his work, but he's like Renaissance person, you know, a scholar. He, was a very respected person in his community. He danced. He's a singer. He was a person charged with recovering grave goods and reburying. I mean, he just as a poet, an artist, a professor, you know. I just really, I saw him occupy all these places with, you know, really a lot of respect. But one thing he did for us was bring in the elders, you know, the basket makers, and basically we would have conferences that were not talking heads, where people talked at you, like, here we're sitting here being talking heads, but, things that were interactive, bring people in, we'd sit around, we'd talk, and usually the elders would always grab you and make you sit down and make a basket, and of course, that meant that you sat down with that person for like 3 hours, and chatted as they helped you make this basket. Nobody ever asked you, who do you think you are? There was such a generosity, an openness, and not a fear that somehow things were going to be stolen or taken or, And yet, all our politics over the last 50 years have brought us to this place where the language that we have seems to be more important than the actuality. It's not as generous, but so I feel that the generosity of it is, is that we know they had this idea that things had to live. They had this feeling that we had to keep it alive, and these were folks that didn't necessarily have all of the protections, federal protections. Our world has definitely changed politically. And I guess in it, I don't want to lose the generosity of spirit that has existed. So when I'm thinking about, the ability to then have a moment that we call performative, where you open the door and you welcome people in and you're not worried or concerned that they somehow are going to run off with your things, because people run off with their things all the time. They don't have to sit there to run off with them. You can't control that, really, because the people that you're trying to control, are usually the ones that are well behaved. The ones that are going to take off with it. They're not too interested. They figure out how to do that anyway. And so I don't want to be cynical. And I'm not saying that the truths of the last 50 years haven't happened. There's a lot of issues at hand, and a lot of misunderstandings. But I feel like if we think back to this idea of generosity and engagement, that maybe it might give us something different, ability for us to talk to each other. I keep coming back to that always, coming back to this idea of being able to talk to each other. As people come in to a space where they are able to feel, welcome and able to feel like they too have something. So I kept saying that when we say, mi casa es su casa, my home is your home, and people come in, and then so some of the sayings are, well, since my house is your house, but it is my house, and when I say enough, that have the wherewithal to leave, right, to go home. And so now I'm saying, well, okay, if you come to my house and it's open and it's all here, then maybe when you come, you might want to bring something too. Like, you might want to bring something of yourself. You might not want to think, well, I have nothing to bring. You might want to just think, well, what is it that I do have to bring? And to actually go home and look for that in your own home, that what it is you're bringing that really matters to you. Because if it matters to you, then it will be received in that way. So I am taking my own advice too, right? I had to go home and find, what do I have that matters? What is it that I'm not seeing that has value to me, therefore maybe might have value in this circle, in this space, in this place. So it's kind of like, this has all been brewing. And so I keep saying that I don't want our language to get ahead of us. The language, it has to reflect our practice. So I think that's the aspect of the performative, of what we call installation, we call performance. All those are words that basically for me with Chicano movement meant, that we were able to come in and participate. That in the participation there's something to be gained, and you never know. I think I learned that, too, at RCAF, had open sessions of barrio art making, where you would be engaged with everybody who showed up. And I think those things is something that we desperately need now, as everybody's gone off to their corner again and only meet with language, which sometimes is not very fruitful. I don't know. I just keep going back to the same thing, right? That what is, when people say the word ritual and the word ceremony, and we use those words, they leave me cold. I can't quite get there because I don't understand really the word ritual. I don't really understand it. In process. When I think about a ceremony, I think about people coming together to do something. That's how it's always been phrased. We come together to do something, and there's a purpose and a reason behind it. It isn't empty. So when we talk about art, sometimes we think about exhibiting. I had to take back and go think about what does it mean to exhibit. Like, it seemed like a cold word, like, it's just there and people come look at it and there's nothing to be engaged in. And I started thinking about how ceremonially people speak about arming things, like turning them on. They speak in the language, like there's a moment when everything becomes clear called power time. That kind of thing, where there's language that says, if you come together and you begin doing, there's a moment of igniting, where everybody knows that they're there to do this. It becomes clear, like all of a sudden everything connects and you feel this sense that you came to do this. Maybe people use the word, that you call in the spirit, but I think a lot of people don't necessarily believe that there is a spirit that does come in and you feel it because all of a sudden you feel connected, and that it doesn't necessarily mean like you get technicolor vision, cinemascope. It means that you come together and you have a moment where you feel that you all have purpose and you've all contributed to that purpose. And if you find yourself wandering around and you're not connected and you don't know what's going on, it just means that, you got a lot of trauma to get through, or you have to, kind of figure out like, it's okay. So I think all of those things are things that you don't know until you come into the room and then you feel it, and so everybody who does, I believe, work ceremonially always tries to achieve that moment where we all come together to do that thing, and it has that moment of brilliance and you all go away feeling good, and know that whatever you were able to contribute was a good thing, and that's the best of it, right? It's not the always of it, but it's the best of it. It's the intention that you want. And so I think in art making, I think that's what I'd strive for, right? That there's that as I'm working, as I'm painting, or as I'm drawing, or as I'm speaking, or as I'm trying to ignite something, that you want that moment, where there's an engagement. And here we are.
I'd like to also add a little bit, say something, if you guys don't mind. Once again, Aurelio, I just wanted to say a couple words on behalf of my mom here. The fact that she's an instructor at the university, once here at this university and then now down in Santa Barbara, the other professors here, the curators and stuff, they're under the eye, Anything they say, they could stamp it on the school paper, and then 25 people would say, hey, gee, did she said that? Oh, that's really bad. You have to really, unfortunately, really watch what you say, how you say it, almost to where you might even not want to say anything because of that extreme criticism, and then when you have jobs attached to that, your jobs are hinged on that, especially when you're a teacher or professor, like that, your jobs are hinged on a sense of popularity too. If community don't like you, they don't take your class, and guess what? You're out of a job, So there's a fine line in there. But to speak on behalf of myself and the teachings that I've learned throughout my life, the question that the brothers here were asking about was talking about a line, a bar here. At what point do you cross this line from art and adding this ceremonial spiritual aspect to it? At what point are you crossing the line to where this is right and that's wrong? And then the second part of that question is, what, as artists, what are we supposed to do about that? So my point of view is this. speaking from this line right here, the Ethnic Studies Department, along this road, this avenue, the Chicano Studies, I'll speak from this point of view. In my point of view, the artist's job is to remove that bar. There is no bar. Remove the bar and get it out of there. And there's a reason why I say that. There's a lot of nations in this country. Some of them were a little bit more advanced than others, technologically, engineering, and we know all those things. So we take it back 3,000 years ago. We had a great civilization down in Mesoamerica. And you have a pyramid there, and there's a gentleman that's inscribed on the pyramid. He's carved in there, and he's holding a tobacco. Today, tobacco is one of the most ceremonial things in the Native American Indian world. It's the thing you take for offerings. It's what you use to give to the Creator when you're going to pray to the Creator. It's something that you give to someone to be nice or whatever. It's one of our most important things. But yet here this tribe 3,000 years ago took this tobacco and painted it on the wall for everybody to see. 3,000 years later, 250,000 people later, that picture of that tobacco is still on the wall, painted there. So did they cross the line? Those were real Indians. Today, we're not living outside in the bush anymore, in the teepee. We're not hauling our water, we're not hunting our food, we're not making our clothes. So we're very removed from those original traditional teachings. But those guys weren't, they lived within that. And you see how they did it, they didn't have a problem with it. To me, in my feeling, the Native American point of view, the Chicano point of view, Mexican American born in the United States, raised here, Native American way of life and ceremonial way of life. You look at who put the bar there. Do we as Chicanos have to experience our re-emergence under the guidelines of another culture telling us where the bar should be and where it shouldn't be? When we look at our ancestors, there was no bar there. When we look at this bar and where it comes from, why is it placed there? A long time ago, our people wore eagle feather in their hair every day, everywhere they go. It almost wasn't even sacred. It was so commonplace, everybody does it. But when the colonizers come over here, we all know what happened there, and they told us, you can't wear that eagle feather in your hair anymore. They put a bar right there. Next thing you know, we're trying to paint an eagle on an eagle feather. No, you can't do that. You can't do that. You can't paint that eagle feather because that's sacred. Oh yeah, today, but a long time it was just commonplace. It wasn't even sacred. People did that all the time. It was just a regular old thing. So my point of view is that the artist's job is to remove that bar within our culture here, the Chicano culture, as we are re-emerging into the world and showing our medicine. We don't have to show our medicine under the manipulation and under the guidelines that this other nationality is posing on us, saying, no, you have to do that. And we know why they're doing that.
Yeah.
They don't want this reemergence. That's why they blew up all the temples. That's why they burn all the books. That's why they kill all the old people, the spiritual leaders, the people who knew the language. And they changed the power structure from the grandmothers and moved it down to the young men. That all this is designed to destroy our culture. So now we're here in these institutions, and this institution comes from that other culture. So just being in Chicano studies, we're already stepping outside of what they want. They only giving it to us because we're bugging them and we're telling them, if you don't let us do this, we're going to do this, we need But if we didn't do that, if we didn't have that movement of people, the Chicano artists and people back in the 70s and the 80s and the Chicano Park doing all that kind of stuff and pushing for the reemergence of our culture, we wouldn't have it. And we wouldn't have any help to maintain it. Because we're maintaining it at the blow of our fists, constantly, in all our demonstrations, constantly in everything that we do. So, I just wanted to make a point that sometimes this bar has been taught to other nations of people through the colonization process. And so when they then look at another nation of people and what they're doing, they want to apply that bar there. And sometimes because some people are elderly or older in their ages, they want to use that age to put credibility to that and make it to be that that's the authority or has to be that way. So I just wanted to say, you know, again, that I think that there is no bar in art. When we look to our ancestors, there was no bar. So why today do we need a bar within this new Chicano world or culture? So I just wanted to share those two things, how it comes to me in spirit like that about the bar and where it should be at, or where it shouldn't be at. And then the reasons, you know, we could look at why that bar is even there. Why are we even being asked that? Oh, how come they do that, this ain't right, that ain't right? You know, well, who told you that ain't right? Who taught you that that's not right? And why, when we're trying to teach you that it is right, you can't accept it? Why?
Well,
So-
I think the impact of, thank you, Michael. I think the impact of colonialism and the impact, what you were mentioning too, the impact of how federal regulation has dictated to certain communities of people how they can engage in with their medicine or with their, has really then kind of trickled down to the art making process, which means that as Chicanx, we have a different project, I feel sometimes, than our native brothers and sisters do in terms of what they're doing with their artwork. At least that's what I have found in my conversations at times. Gil, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I want to ask a question. I'm wondering if you can speak to you being a queer Chicana and coming from that, what that, I mean, I think that in itself disrupts a lot of bars. We're talking about bars.
Yeah.
But I also think that you work differently than other Chicano art centers, even though you're still working within that. I think, for example, what you're creating in Santa Barbara comes from a different place. I think Susie, when the exhibition was happening, Susie Cepeda said you were queering the protocol,
Yeah.
right? In the sense that we were reclaiming materiality, or your structures were reclaiming materiality in that way, or even who we invited, who we asked for permission, the elders that were chosen, that worked in a certain structure, but also the lack of defense, I think, that came from Chicanos at that time are particularly significant because it was queer Chicanas that were being attacked, the Chicana artists, right, in that exhibition. And I don't think that was like an oops, I'm sorry, I think it was intentional. It was a violent, intentional act, whether we acknowledge it or not. But I think that this queer Chicana, Indígena kind of methodology framework, you also, I mean, we have all these paintings on the walls, the mixed media, the social streams, the paintings. You reimagine stories and you're telling stories, right? But you're not following Western binaries, Western depictions of it, or even what we would consider like a painting if we are comparing it to like white men or whatever. The structures in itself, right? What you're using the adobe, the medicines that are coming in. So I wonder if you can speak to that and how that influences your work.
Well, thank you for asking that question. I think that one of the things that it has basically been the founding aspect of my life. That as a queer woman, I haven't always been welcomed. Most of the time, I've not necessarily. How do I put it? I've always been myself. So I'm always out on some level, and sometimes I forget because I assume, because I've been out for so long that everybody must know. But I thought when I came back to San Francisco in the early 90s, I outed myself. I thought at the time that I was the last one to come out because everybody was in San Francisco. So I thought, oh geez, well let me hurry up and get there and come out, And then as it turned out, that was like about the last time I was asked to be in a Chicano exhibition. It really did change the nature of the kind of places I was showing at the time. But it did force me then, if I wanted to exhibit, to start curating exhibitions. So that's what started my engagement with the universities, because it was the place where I would, get exhibitions, folks that I could collaborate with, invited me to come show. I would make it a collective and assemble people's work with mine that I could show with. And so it forced me, right, to continue to find ways to be present, because it was very significant, the difference between the moment of outing myself in San Francisco and then what happened in the aftermath. I had to really ask myself for a minute, because I didn't get it, what happened. And then I realized what happened. And so homophobia is alive and well. I came back to San Francisco, in the early 90s, and the first place that I was given work was not in the community that I was raised in, but actually in San Francisco at Proyecto Contra SIDA por Vida. They were the first persons to offer me, a place to work and a place to be. And they were, I felt conservative, little Catholic girl in that space, let me tell you. They were very radical in their notions and their gender and everything. It was a wonderful experience to be there and to come to this, to this place to do that work. So it has always been driven by what I understand. It was my grandmother's feminism. And she was a very strong, woman-centered, and taught me our place as women. And it was kind of not what you expect, not the story that we keep getting told all the time. So for one, she told me that as a woman, I had to have integrity, that was a very important aspect, because, she said, we did not have a man to stand in front of us. We were a family, did not have a man to stand in front of us, therefore we were vulnerable in the world because there was no one to defend us. And she told me not to expect other women to defend me, because women depended on men for their position in the world. That's my mother's feminism. This was my grandmother's, this was her language. I call my grandmother my mother, because she mothered me. She raised me. And so this discussion of what it meant to be a woman in the world, and to have integrity, to be well-spoken, all these things that she would constantly say to me, when I began to study the old language and the Nahuatl language, this is how they describe women: a person who is well-spoken, a person that can defend her community, a person that can speak for her family, etc. There's like 50 different ways of being a woman in terms of how you carried yourself. So as she told me, integrity means that you'll be alone a lot. If you have to stand for what you believe in, you may not necessarily have a lot of people standing there with you, which is what some of the medicine people say. One of my friends, William Baker, always says, geez, when you're trying to do something good, you find yourself all by yourself. So I think in terms of queering the work, I never think about it that way. I just try to be aware of what's being said or not said. Like recently I've been saying that I worked really hard in terms of serving the mother, the great mother, and looking at where we have been driven to, looking at our world and looking at the condition of the great mother, our earth. But not too long ago, in doing the work with my partner Cherie Moraga, we were looking at doing one of her plays, The Hungry Woman, and we became, through the study, we're talking about art as practice, as research. In order to make present the set design and the costume design, which was integral to her storytelling, we had to do this research on the Great Mother, Coatlicue, the Hungry Woman, herself, Tlazoteotl, and all of these different deities that are just a part. They're just like, I think, been very influenced by archaeology and the language, interpretation, translation, and have really picked apart things and moved things apart that have always been together, have created binaries where they're not, have decided that they're female when they're not necessarily so, or male when they're not. So in looking at all this work, it's become clear that one of the aspects that we had not been looking at was the male aspect of our earth. The male reigns, the male waters, the male earth. What did that mean? I kept saying, we don't know what it means because, the language has been occupied. So it's only through the ceremonial practice that you start to understand some of those things. And of course, I don't know, because some of the ceremonial practice is within certain traditions, and you have to be present. And having been a person, with a, who is working as an artist and teaching, that has not been my dedicated place. That's why, in a sense, my son is back there talking, who has spent many, many years. And every time he talks to me and tells me about a particular ceremony and how it functions, and, I start to understand something I didn't know before, even the sense of the ceremony that has been gendered, and why, and how, and when, and all of those kind of questions. Because it's not all the time or flat, but it has to do with seasons, it has to do with years and times, and all of that has been the disruption of our continent, of the knowledge of our continent, of the philosophy, the spiritual knowledge of our continent. So I'm sitting here going, well, I know about this much. And as we then keep calling it up, we keep getting the opportunities to look at it maybe a little bit differently.